Number 1. Richard Fran Biegenwald was born on August 24, 1940, on Staten Island, New York. Known to authorities and the media as the Thrill Killer, he was a man whose life would alternately intersect with psychiatric institutions, prison cells, and unsolved deaths over more than 2 decades. In his early years, Biegenwald's family environment was unstable and violent. His father struggled with alcoholism, and Richard experienced frequent beatings in his home. Behavioral problems emerged almost immediately. By age 5, he had set fire to the family residence and was sent for observation at a psychiatric center in Rockland County. Within a few years, he was drinking and gambling, and by age 9, he had undergone electroshock therapy at Bellevue Hospital in New York. Progress through school was minimal. He completed only the 8th grade and dropped out shortly after beginning high school. From an early age, Biegenwald's life was marked by chaos. Beyond his early institutional placements, he exhibited escalating criminal behavior in adolescence, including theft and car theft that resulted in arrest and federal detention for transporting stolen property across state lines. After returning to Staten Island in the late 1950s, he drifted toward violent crime, culminating in his first known murder at age 18. On a cold December day in 1958, Biegenwald and an accomplice entered a grocery store in Bayonne, New Jersey. Biegenwald shot the store owner, Stephen Sladowski, during the course of a robbery attempt. Sladowski was a respected figure in his community, known for his civic engagement and dedication to his family and work. Within days, Biegenwald was captured in Maryland after a confrontation with law enforcement that left both him and a trooper wounded. Extradited back to New Jersey, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. During his first incarceration, Biegenwald spent nearly 17 years behind bars, where he learned trades such as printing and machine work. In the mid-1970s, he was released on parole and attempted to build a conventional life. He held odd jobs married and tried to stay under the radar. But the stability was short-lived. Within a few years, his pattern of increasingly dangerous behavior returned. Between 1981 and 1982, Biegenwald's criminal activities escalated into a spree of abductions and murders that would terrorize parts of New Jersey, especially the Jersey Shore communities. His victims included young women and men he encountered in towns like Asbury Park and Point Pleasant Beach. Among those later linked to him were 17-year-old Maria Tialella and 17-year-old Deborah Osborne, both of whom disappeared in late 1981 and early 1982. Another young woman, Anna Olesiewicz, 18 years old, was taken after leaving the boardwalk in Asbury Park. Drug dealer William Ward, who had escaped from prison, was also killed during this period. Betsy Bacon, a teenager, vanished in late 1982 and was later linked to Biegenwald as well. Investigators struggled for months to connect these disappearances to a single perpetrator. The breakthrough came after 2 boys discovered a body near a busy roadside restaurant in Ocean Township in early 1983. This discovery prompted renewed focus from local law enforcement. On January 22, 1983, police used a ruse to draw Biegenwald from his home, where they took him into custody without incident, and began uncovering the scale of his crimes. A search of the property which he shared with an associate revealed hidden evidence and weapons. As officers pursued leads, one of Biegenwald's companions cooperated with detectives, leading them to shallow graves and other victims across New Jersey and in Staten Island. At his trial, Biegenwald faced multiple counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors described a pattern of opportunistic violence and escalation that combined elements of control impulsivity and a reported desire simply to see someone die. For the murder of Anna Olesiewicz, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Additional convictions followed for other murders, including William Ward, earning him life imprisonment. Over the course of years in the appellate system, his death sentence was overturned, and eventually all sentences were consolidated into multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. Psychologists who reviewed his background and behavior noted deeply entrenched antisocial traits stemming from trauma, unstable upbringing, and early psychiatric intervention. While experts debated motivations, there was widespread consensus that his actions reflected a profound inability to empathize or restrain violent impulses. After years of incarceration, Richard Fran Biegenwald died of natural causes in prison at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton on March 10, 2008, while serving his life sentences. Number 2. Dellmus Charles Colvin was born on August 3, 1959, in rural Ohio, and would later become known to law enforcement as one of the most prolific long-haul truck drivers, linked to multiple murders across state lines. At the time of his arrest in late November 2005, Colvin was 46 years old and working as a long-distance trucker, moving freight and supplies through Ohio, New Jersey, and beyond. Before his crimes came to light, Colvin maintained a seemingly ordinary life. Friends and neighbors described a mostly quiet man who worked long hours and kept to himself, partly due to the solitary nature of his job. He grew up in Akron, Ohio, where he participated in team sports such as wrestling and football during his school years, and by his own accounts, his early family life did not appear outwardly troubled. Despite occasional conflicts with his mother as a teenager, there was no widely documented history of early aggressive conduct that would have foreshadowed the violent pattern he later developed. Colvin's psychological and situational triggers are complex and debated among investigators and experts who have reviewed his case. After high school, he took on driving jobs that took him along interstate highways, a lifestyle that placed him in constant motion, often isolated from stable social networks. Law enforcement analyses in similar cases have noted how the long-haul trucking world can provide anonymity and mobility factors that serial offenders may exploit to avoid detection. Although Colvin did not have a formally diagnosed mental illness widely publicized in court records, during his interviews with law enforcement and researchers, he acknowledged deep-seated resentment toward women and expressed misogynistic attitudes that some experts have interpreted as emotional instability and possibly rooted in personal relationships that left him feeling rejected or inferior. Between the late 1980s and the early 2005, Colvin kidnapped and killed at least 7 women, most of whom were vulnerable due to poverty addiction or engagement in sex work. The confirmed victims include 27-year-old Donna Lee White, 38-year-old Valerie Jones, 40-year-old Dorothea Wetzel, 42-year-old Jacqueline Thomas, 33-year-old Jackie Simpson, 37-year-old Melissa Weber, and 45-year-old Lily Summers. Most of these women were encountered at truck stops, bars, or other places near Colvin's routes where they might agree to accompany him for conversation or a ride. Once in his truck, Colvin would detain them and later strangle them, a method that required close control and silence consistent with his occupation's practical constraints. Afterward, he concealed their remains in wooded areas near roadsides or isolated stretches of land. Investigators later determined that these victims shared no personal connection to him beyond brief encounters along his regular travel routes. The investigation that ultimately linked Colvin to these killings began with a separate incident in April 2004 when a woman escaped from him after being assaulted and reported the encounter to police. During that investigation, law enforcement obtained a sample of his DNA. In the autumn of 2005, that DNA match connected Colvin to evidence from multiple unsolved cases, prompting his arrest in Toledo, Ohio, on November 20th of that year. Once in custody, he was charged with several murders and additional counts of rape and assault. Prosecutors working with the Lucas County Attorney General's office offered a plea agreement that removed the possibility of a death sentence in exchange for Colvin's guilty plea to multiple counts of murder and related charges. During the plea proceedings, he admitted involvement in several killings spanning years across state borders. Public and media response to Colvin's arrest was intense, particularly because the pattern of his crimes had gone undetected for such a long period. Families of the victims expressed relief that answers had finally emerged, but also frustration that earlier investigative efforts had not connected the dots sooner across jurisdictions. At a later date, Colvin was also extradited to New Jersey, where he pled guilty to the 1987 murder of Donna Lee White and received additional prison time concurrent with his existing sentences. Number 3. Richard Francis Cottingham was born on November 25, 1946, in the Bronx, New York. At the time of his arrest on May 22, 1980, he was 33 years old and employed as a computer operator for a New York health insurance company while living with his wife and their 3 children in New Jersey. To neighbors and co-workers, Cottingham appeared to lead an ordinary life. He had completed his schooling, married, and held a steady job, all the outward markers of a conventional suburban existence. According to some reports, he enjoyed solitary hobbies, and as a young man raised homing pigeons and struggled to form close friendships, traits that later biographers have observed as part of his isolated social world. Despite this unremarkable public image, those closest to Cottingham noted troubling shifts in his personal life as his adult years progressed. Friends recalled that he was often intense in conversation and harbored deeply negative attitudes toward women, which over time became more pronounced. After the birth of his 3rd child in the mid-1970s, his wife filed for divorce, citing emotional distance and erratic behavior, withdrawing the petition only after Cottingham's arrest. Researchers and other observers have suggested that these personal fractures and Cottingham's fixation on sexual control and dominance may have been early indicators of an underlying psychological disturbance. While there is no public record of a formal diagnosis of mental illness at the time, later interviews with law enforcement and experts described patterns of escalating obsessive behavior that correlated with his crimes. Between the late 1960s and 1980, Cottingham systematically targeted vulnerable women across New York City and northern New Jersey. Investigators later linked him to at least 11 confirmed murders between that period, though Cottingham himself has claimed responsibility for as many as 100 killings nationwide. His victims were often young women encountered in bars, on city streets, or near transportation hubs, many of whom were involved in sex work or were otherwise marginalized. Cottingham's method involved approaching these women, gaining their trust or compliance, and then isolating them in hotel rooms or secluded locations. Once there, he would restrain assault and ultimately strangle them. In the most notorious case associated with him in December 1979, 2 women were discovered in a Times Square hotel room after a fire drew first responders. The victims had been killed, and the scene was disturbed in ways that horrified investigators and the public alike. As Cottingham's pattern continued, a mixture of investigative setbacks and jurisdictional gaps allowed him to remain undetected for years. In May 1980, a motel maid at a New Jersey inn heard the screams of an 18-year-old woman whom Cottingham was attacking. Her cries prompted staff to summon police. Officers arrived and found Cottingham in the hallway. The victim survived and immediately identified him. This near escape and swift report by witnesses ended his spree. Once in custody, authorities uncovered further evidence linking him to several unsolved homicides. During his trials, prosecutors brought forward evidence and testimonies that placed Cottingham at the scenes of multiple murders. In May 1981, he was convicted in New Jersey and received a long sentence. Subsequent convictions in New York added further years with combined sentences extending to well over a century. In the decades since his initial incarceration, Cottingham has confessed to additional murders, and in recent years he admitted responsibility for the long unsolved killing of an 18-year-old nursing student in 1965 after investigators reopened that case based on his statements. Law enforcement officials have publicly acknowledged that these confessions have provided closure for families who had waited decades for answers. Psychologists and criminal experts who have examined Cottingham's history have described him as exhibiting traits consistent with deeply entrenched antisocial and controlling impulses. He told interviewers that his actions were tied to a desire for power and dominance over his victims, framing his crimes as an expression of psychological control rather than personal connection. Cottingham's capacity to lead a double life, working a regular job while committing these offenses, has been a point of interest in studies of criminal psychology. Cottingham remains incarcerated at Southwood State Prison in Bridgeton, New Jersey, serving multiple life sentences with no possibility of release. Number 4. Charles Edmund Cullen was born on February 22, 1960 in West Orange, New Jersey. At the time of his arrest on December 14, 2003, he was 43 years old and employed as a registered nurse working night shifts in hospitals and medical centers across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. To many of his colleagues, Cullen initially appeared to be a dedicated caregiver. He had completed training in nursing after serving in the United States Navy and was for a time regarded as reliable and methodical in his duties. At home, he was a father and husband roles that reinforced an outward image of normalcy. Despite this surface impression, Cullen exhibited a reserved personality and tended to keep his deeper thoughts and emotions to himself. Cullen's psychological or situational triggers can be traced at least in part to a troubled personal history. He was the youngest of 8 children in a household that suffered the early loss of both parents. His father died when Cullen was very young, and his mother died in an accident when he was a teenager. Cullen later described feelings of isolation and emotional detachment that persisted into adulthood. According to some reports, he struggled with a sense of alienation from his peers and demonstrated difficulty forming close relationships. During his time in the Navy, he was said to feel ostracized by fellow sailors, experiences that may have deepened his internal sense of estrangement. Experts who have studied Cullen's case noted that this combination of isolation and unresolved trauma likely contributed to his later actions, particularly when he gained the opportunity to work in settings where life and death decisions were made daily. Beginning in the late 1980s and continuing until his arrest in 2003, Cullen used his nursing role to end the lives of patients under his care. Most of his victims were elderly or medically fragile adults admitted to hospitals for treatment, but not all were terminal. Investigators confirmed that he intentionally administered lethal doses of medication or manipulated medical equipment, causing death in ways that routinely mimicked natural failure. Cullen later told detectives that he administered these overdoses impulsively and rationalized his actions as sparing patients from perceived suffering, even though many victims were expected to recover. In some cases, the drugs he used were common therapeutic agents that in excessive doses overwhelmed the body's systems. Because Cullen worked at multiple facilities and often on night shifts, his actions went unnoticed for years amid the ordinary daily flow of medical care. The pattern of unexplained deaths in hospitals where Cullen worked eventually drew attention from colleagues and medical staff. In the early 2000s, concerns were raised at Somerset Medical Center in New Jersey after several deaths occurred under unusual circumstances. A trusting relationship developed between Cullen and fellow nurse Amy Loughran, who initially saw him as a dependable coworker. However, as deaths accumulated and patterns emerged, Loughran became uneasy, and working with detectives helped authorities investigate the suspicious cluster of patient losses. The involvement of law enforcement revealed a broader trail of unexplained deaths, stretching back many years and across multiple institutions. Cullen was arrested in December 2003 after investigators matched hospital records with patterns of lethal medication use that pointed directly to him. During his trials in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Cullen faced multiple counts of murder related to the deaths of patients in his care. In New Jersey, he pled guilty to 22 counts of murder and several related charges. In Pennsylvania, he later pled guilty to 7 additional counts. Prosecutors agreed to a plea deal that spared him the death penalty in exchange for his cooperation and identification of victims. Media coverage of the case was extensive, with the press dubbing him an angel of death due to the clinical context of his crimes and the betrayal of trust inherent in his role as a nurse. Families of victims expressed profound grief and frustration, pressing hospitals and regulators to account for how Cullen's actions went undetected for so long. Psychological assessments and Cullen's own statements to detectives revealed a complicated motivation. Cullen claimed that he acted out of a belief that patients were suffering, and that by ending their lives he was relieving pain. He admitted to acting on impulse, and later said he lived much of his life in a fog, unable to recall exactly how many patients he killed or why he chose them. Some experts have interpreted his behavior as an extreme manifestation of control and detachment with Cullen, using his clinical knowledge to exert power over life and death in ways that bypassed ethical safeguards. Cullen ultimately pled guilty to 29 murders and received consecutive life sentences in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. He is incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where he is serving multiple life terms with no eligibility for parole. Number 5. Richard Leonard Kuklinski was born on April 11, 1935, in Jersey City, New Jersey. By the time he was arrested in the mid-1980s, Kuklinski was known to authorities and the public as the Iceman. Though his official convictions were limited to a handful of deaths, Kuklinski's own statements and later reporting linked him to a much wider pattern of lethal conduct over more than 3 decades. At the time of his arrest, he was 51 years old and had spent much of his adult life moving between legitimate work and criminal subcultures. In his neighborhood and among his family, Kuklinski presented as a devoted husband and father, maintaining the outward appearance of an ordinary suburban life in New Jersey, while those closest to him remained unaware of his darker pursuits. Kuklinski's early life was marked by instability, violence, and emotional trauma. Raised by parents who struggled with their own challenges, including physical abuse and neglect, he encountered violence in the home from a young age. Childhood accounts describe restless behavior and early encounters with cruelty. Experts later linked these formative experiences to patterns that contributed to his capacity for harm as an adult. By his teenage years, he had dropped out of school after the 8th grade, a turning point that led him into coarse social circles and criminal activity. As a young adult, Kuklinski moved from petty street crime into more organized forms of wrongdoing, including burglary rings and illegal distribution of pirated films, which introduced him to figures in organized crime and the world of illicit earnings. Over the course of the 1960s through the 1980s, Kuklinski operated at the intersection of organized crime and freelance violence. He developed a reputation as a contract killer for various Italian-American crime families based in New York and New Jersey, including the Genovese and De Cavalcante organizations, though some experts have questioned the full extent of his documented ties, while law enforcement could only conclusively link him to a handful of confirmed murders. Kuklinski himself claimed responsibility for many more, sometimes asserting figures that reached into the hundreds. Investigators have treated these broader claims with caution, noting that many remain unverified. The nickname the Iceman came from his practice of freezing a victim's remains in an attempt to disguise the time of death, a tactic that both intrigued and alarmed forensic experts and prosecutors. Kuklinski's victims were primarily men whom he encountered through criminal networks or arranged meetings. In documented cases, he would lure individuals with promises of business deals, payments, or shared ventures only to betray them once they were isolated. Methods varied. Some victims were shot, others poisoned or strangled, and in at least one case, a body was concealed inside a barrel. One of the early documented victims was a man murdered over a debt. His body was found in a storage container in New Jersey. Another man who vanished after meeting Kuklinski for a videotape purchase was later found partially frozen in a New York roadside area, evidence that led investigators to adopt Kuklinski's infamous moniker. Kuklinski's demeanor in interviews after his arrest often conveyed a chilling calm and matter-of-fact explanation of his actions, contributing to public fascination and deep unease with his case. The investigation that brought Kuklinski to justice was lengthy and complex. Law enforcement agencies noting patterns of missing men linked to his social circle and financial dealings established a task force that combined state, county, and federal resources. An undercover operation spanned many months, during which investigators gained Kuklinski's confidence by posing as criminal associates who could supply materials for alleged hits. A key turning point came when Kuklinski discussed methods of poisoning and hinted at ongoing lethal intentions. This provided sufficient probable cause for arrest. In December 1986, Kuklinski was taken into custody during a traffic stop at a New Jersey highway checkpoint, along with a firearm. His wife was also charged in connection with interfering in his arrest. During trial proceedings, prosecutors presented evidence linking Kuklinski to multiple murders. In March 1988, he was convicted of several first-degree murder charges and sentenced to consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Years later, in 2003, he entered a guilty plea for an additional killing, further extending his prison commitments. In interviews and media appearances while incarcerated, Kuklinski continued to discuss his life and crimes, prompting documentaries and books that explored both his psychological profile and the cultural impact of his actions. Law enforcement experts have described his motives as rooted in a mix of financial gain survival within criminal hierarchies and a hardened acceptance of violence developed over decades. Richard Leonard Kuklinski died of natural causes while serving his life sentences in a New Jersey prison on March 5, 2006. Number 6. Richard Leonard Adam Leroy Lane was born on August 7, 1964, in Jonesville, North Carolina, and by the summer of 2007 he was working as a long-distance truck driver. At the time of his arrest on July 30, 2007, Lane was 43 years old. Married and the father of 3 daughters, he lived with his family in a trailer near his home state, and to most people he appeared to be a hard-working man maintaining the demanding rhythms of life on the road. Lane dropped out of high school and later took jobs that kept him away from home for long stretches, including trucking and occasional work in a poultry processing plant, a pattern that shaped both his schedule and his interactions with people along travel routes. Despite this outwardly unremarkable life, there were undercurrents in Lane's personal history that would later concern investigators and psychologists who reviewed his case. Friends and family reported that he was quiet and somewhat withdrawn, with occasional expressions of frustration about financial pressures and personal stress. While there is no formal public record of a clinical diagnosis of mental illness, the actions Lane later took suggested a capacity for impulsive violence and potentially distorted views of risk and consequence. In his truck, Lane carried items related to hunting and survival, including large knives, and according to court evidence, a DVD of a film about a fictional serial killer. That film, Hunting Humans, later became a focus of media and law enforcement interest because it illustrated the disturbing overlap between real-world violence and fictional fascination with killers. In the summer of 2007, a series of attacks near interstate highways in the northeastern United States brought Lane to the attention of law enforcement. On the night of July 13th, in suburban West Hanover Township near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, 42-year-old Darlene Ewalt was outside her home on the patio when Lane encountered her. She was speaking on the telephone with a friend when Lane stabbed her with a knife, killing her. The attack occurred in the early hours of the morning when the neighborhood was quiet and most residents were asleep. Just days later, on July 17th, Lane entered a home in rural York County, Pennsylvania, where 37-year-old Patricia Brooks was asleep on her couch. Brooks woke to find Lane standing in her living room and sustained serious injuries when he stabbed her. She survived the encounter and later recounted her experience to authorities. 14 days after the first known attack on July 29th, Lane was in Bloomsbury, New Jersey, where 38-year-old Monica Massaro was at her residence. According to investigators, Lane entered Massaro's duplex and stabbed her in her bedroom. Her body was discovered by state troopers who had been dispatched for a welfare check after no one had heard from Massaro for some time. These incidents left law enforcement agencies in multiple states collaborating to understand whether one individual was responsible. DNA evidence collected from Lane's knife and gloves, as well as other physical evidence gathered from crime scenes, allowed investigators to connect him to the Ewalt murder and the earlier attack on Brooks. Through shared databases and interagency cooperation, detectives pieced together Lane's travels along major highways and interstate routes that matched the timing and location of the attacks. The final confrontation occurred on July 30, 2007, in Chelmsford, Massachusetts. Lane had stopped along a highway and entered a family home while a 15-year-old girl was asleep. Her parents awoke to noises and discovered Lane inside her room armed with a large knife. In the struggle that followed, the girl's father subdued Lane and restrained him until police arrived to make the arrest. This dramatic arrest marked the end of Lane's flight and initiated legal processes in 3 states. Lane faced charges in Massachusetts for the home invasion and stabbing attempt, resulting in a lengthy prison sentence. In New Jersey, prosecutors charged him with the murder of Monica Massaro. He was sentenced to 50 years in prison. In Pennsylvania, Lane avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty to multiple charges, including the murder of Darlene Ewalt, which resulted in a sentence of life imprisonment. Additional terms were added for the attempted murder of Patricia Brooks and related offenses. Lane is currently serving his sentences at the State Correctional Institution in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. Psychologists and criminologists who have reviewed the case have noted that Lane's selection of victims appeared random and opportunistic, tied more to circumstance and proximity than to personal acquaintance. His job as a truck driver placed him on the road for extended periods, meeting strangers at rest stops or residential areas near major highways, and investigators have suggested that this mobility may have facilitated the pattern of attacks without detection for several weeks. Lane's current status is that of a convicted murderer, serving multiple decades to life for his crimes in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Number 7. Howard Barton Unruh was born on January 21, 1921, in the East Camden neighborhood of Camden, New Jersey. By the morning of September 6, 1949, he was 28 years old, employed as a sheet metal worker and a veteran of the Second World War, where he had served as an armored crewman in the United States Army. To the people who knew him before the tragedy that would make his name infamous, Unruh seemed quiet and unremarkable. A man with a reserved personality devoted to his mother, and someone whose social life was largely confined to his home and neighborhood. He had briefly studied pharmacy after the war, and friends recalled he was friendly when asked about local affairs, though perhaps weighed down by his experiences overseas and the challenges of adjusting to civilian life. Unruh's psychological and situational triggers reflect a complex interplay of post-war trauma, social isolation, and escalating suspicion. After returning home from combat service in Europe, where he participated in key battles such as the Battle of the Bulge. Unruh lived with his mother and continued to surround himself with military paraphernalia and firearms he had brought back from overseas. Over time, neighbors began to view him as eccentric, making remarks about his attachment to his mother and his solitary habits. In the months leading up to September 6th, Unruh became increasingly resentful toward those in his community whom he believed mocked him or spoke poorly of his character. He documented perceived slights in a personal diary and marked the names of neighbors he felt had wronged him. This buildup of bitterness and paranoia, compounded by signs that medical professionals later attributed to a severe mental health condition, paranoid schizophrenia set the stage for what would unfold later that year. On the morning of September 6, 1949, Unruh left his home armed with a Luger P-08 pistol he had acquired after the war. What followed became known in local history as the Walk of Death, a short but devastating series of shootings through the Kramer Hill section of Camden. Unruh first encountered a bread delivery driver on River Road and fired at him, though the shot missed. Over the next 12 minutes, Unruh moved along the block, confronting neighbors and passers-by without personal connection to most of them. He entered a shoemaker's shop and killed the owner, then entered a barber shop where he shot the barber and a young boy sitting in a chair waiting for his haircut. Passing a nearby pharmacy, he encountered an insurance salesman and fatally shot him for not moving out of his way. Neighbors and families in the area were stunned as the events unfolded with little warning. In total, 13 people were killed, and several others injured in the brief, unfocused rampage that cut across men, women, and children who happened to be in his path. The response from the community and law enforcement was swift. Police quickly surrounded Unruh's apartment after the shooting, and through efforts that included tear gas and negotiation, he surrendered without further resistance later that same day. Unruh cooperated with investigators and provided detailed accounts of his actions during the rampage. Charges were filed against him, including 13 counts of willful and malicious slayings with malice aforethought and several counts of assault. But during legal proceedings, it became clear that Unruh's mental state was a central issue. Psychologists and medical experts diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, finding that his delusional thinking and grievances toward his neighbors were symptoms of a profound mental health disorder rather than calculated malice. As a result, he was found not guilty of the charges by reason of insanity and committed to the New Jersey Hospital for the Insane, later known as Trenton Psychiatric Hospital, where he was confined to the maximum security Vroom building. Media coverage at the time, and in subsequent years, reflected widespread shock and sadness. The killings in Camden were reported nationally as one of the earliest mass shooting incidents in post-war American history, and the tragic loss of life reverberated through the tight-knit neighborhoods where the events occurred. Families of victims, community leaders, and journalists grappled with understanding how a local resident, known by some as reclusive but harmless, could suddenly unleash such destruction. The conversations that emerged touched on topics ranging from mental health care for veterans to the dynamics of small-town social relations and the challenges of recognizing warning signs before tragedy strikes. Unruh's psychological profile, shaped by wartime experiences, increasing suspicion, social isolation, and escalating paranoia, became a focus for experts examining spree killings and mass violence. His motives, as articulated in his own words and interpretations from clinicians, centered on a distorted belief that neighbors had harmed or ridiculed him, prompting a delusional urge for retaliation. While psychologists debated the precise interplay of factors, his case has been studied in discussions of the impact of untreated mental illness and the difficulties in identifying when perceptions of grievance transition into violent outcomes. Howard Barton Unruh spent the remainder of his life under institutional care at the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital's Vroom building and died there on October 19, 2009, at the age of 88. Number 8. Robert Zarinsky was born on September 2, 1940, in Linden, New Jersey. At the time of his arrest on February 22, 1975, he was 34 years old and worked intermittently in small jobs, often struggling to build a stable career or social life. To neighbors and acquaintances in Linden, Zarinsky appeared somewhat quiet and introverted, a local man with a modest work history and a private personal life. He grew up in a working-class household, with his parents and a younger sister Judith, and maintained close ties to his family as an adult. This family proximity would later play a complex role in law enforcement's efforts to understand his life and alleged crimes. Psychological or situational triggers in Zarinsky's life are challenging to pinpoint with precision, but patterns of escalatory behavior emerged over years before deadly offenses came to light. In his early adulthood, he faced brushes with the law for lesser criminal activity, and those episodes were compounded by a controlling family environment at home, particularly around his mother, who was protective and at times enabled his secrecy. Those close to him later recounted that Zarinsky often appeared tense and nervous in social settings, with a simmering resentment toward people he felt had slighted him. Investigators and psychologists have suggested that Zarinsky's unresolved emotional conflicts and long-standing social dissatisfaction may have contributed to behaviors that escalated into violence. Between the mid-1960s and early 1970s, a series of unexplained disappearances and murders of teenage girls near Monmouth County, New Jersey, prompted growing concern among law enforcement and families. Among these victims was 17-year-old Rosemary Calandriello, who vanished in August 1969 while walking home from a party in Atlantic Highlands. Calandriello was last seen near Zarinsky's vehicle, a Ford convertible, and was never found. Investigators suspected foul play early in the case, though the absence of a body made prosecution difficult. In 1975, after increased suspicion and investigative focus, Zarinsky was charged with Calandriello's murder. He denied involvement for many years, But at trial, the prosecutor presented evidence that placed him in the vicinity of her disappearance and suggested his involvement in her death. Though Calandriello's remains were never recovered, a jury convicted Zarinsky, making his conviction notable as one of the first in New Jersey without a body in evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison, a verdict upheld on appeal. While serving this sentence, investigators continued reviewing cold cases from the region. In March 2008, a grand jury indicted Zarinsky for the 1968 murder of 13-year-old Jane Unruh, a child last seen attending a school event in Keansburg. This indictment came after advances in forensic science allowed new examinations of old evidence, though Zarinsky would die before this case went to trial. In February 2016, authorities announced that modern DNA analysis had linked Zarinsky to the 1965 death of the 18-year-old Mary Agnes Kuklinski, whose body had been discovered near a highway in Holmdel. While prosecutors did not publicly disclose all details of the corroborative evidence, they stated that biological samples preserved from the original investigation now matched Zarinsky's DNA profile, providing closure in a decades-old case. Zarinsky was also considered a prime suspect in several other unsolved deaths of teenage girls in Monmouth Union and Middlesex counties from the late 1960s into the early 1970s. Cases involving 17-year-old Linda Balabano, of Union 14-year-old Doreen Carlucci, and 15-year-old Joanne DeLardo of Woodbridge Township, among others, showed similarities in timing and location that law enforcement believed could connect them to Zarinsky, though evidence was insufficient for criminal charges in those instances. Outside of the teenage homicide cases, Zarinsky was linked through testimony from relatives and acquaintances to the 1958 shooting death of a Rahway police officer during a burglary. A trial in 2001 acquitted him of that charge due to questions about witness credibility and evidence, though a later civil verdict initially found him responsible before appellate courts reversed the award. Experts who later examined Zarinsky's history noted a complex psychological profile shaped by early social discomfort and an apparent capacity for secrecy. He often boasted to investigators that he could solve numerous killings if authorities would consider his statements a claim that some law enforcement officials viewed skeptically as self-serving. Robert Zarinsky died of pulmonary fibrosis in the hospice unit of South Woods State Prison in Bridgeton, New Jersey, on November 28, 2008, after spending more than 3 decades incarcerated under a life sentence. Number 9. Richard Westall Rogers, Jr. was born in June 1950 in Plymouth, Massachusetts. By the time he was arrested on May 30, 2001, he was 50 years old and working as a registered nurse in the cardiac care unit of Mount Sinai Medical Center in New York City, a position he had held for more than 2 decades. Rogers was quiet and studious as a young man, earning a bachelor's degree in French and later completing a master's degree in nursing after moving to New York. Friends and coworkers described him as polite, but reserved someone who kept his personal life private and had few close social connections outside work. Publicly, he showed all the signs of a successful professional dedicated to his patients and his community. Despite this outward stability, aspects of Rogers's personal life and earlier experiences hinted at deeper psychological tensions. In adolescence and young adulthood, he was timid and introverted, described as skinny, and often the target of teasing in school. In the late 1960s, he was briefly institutionalized after a violent incident involving a neighbor, but was released and went on to complete his education. During his nursing career, Rogers frequented New York City's gay nightlife, particularly piano bars, where social interaction and late nights were part of the scene. Known to some patrons, but largely anonymous outside that world, he presented a social dichotomy, engaging in the city's vibrant queer community while maintaining a discrete personal identity. Between the early 1990s and mid-1993, a series of disappearances and murders of gay and bisexual men began to unfold along major transportation routes in the northeastern United States. These incidents came to be known as the last call killings named for the manner in which victims were thought to have been encountered at bars shortly after last call, the final announcement before a bar closed for the night. In several cases, men were reported missing after nights out in Manhattan, and later found dead in roadside areas in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. Notable among these were 57-year-old Thomas Mulcahy, a married father of 4 who had been seen at a Midtown piano bar before his disappearance, 44-year-old Anthony Edward Marrero, who lived in Manhattan, and other men who vanished under similar circumstances. In each case, investigations later found evidence linking the victims' last known movements through shared social spaces frequented by gay and bisexual men in the city. Law enforcement agencies struggled for years to connect the cases and identify a suspect. At the time, communication barriers and limited forensic technology made linking the killings difficult, and homophobic bias within law enforcement hindered early investigative efforts, as some officials did not fully grasp the significance of patterns emerging from the victims' last known locations and social circles. In response to these cases, local police departments, state police, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation began coordinating their inquiries to understand whether a single perpetrator was responsible. The breakthrough came in 2001, when improved fingerprint technology allowed authorities to lift ridge prints from plastic bags used to contain remains in one of the cases. Those prints matched Rogers's records from a much earlier investigation dating back to the 1970s in Maine, where he had been acquitted of killing a college roommate. This match led to his arrest on May 30, 2001, on Staten Island, ending a multi-year search for a suspect in the last call killings. During legal proceedings that began in October 2005, prosecutors presented evidence tying Rogers to 2 of the murders, including those of Mulcahy and Marrero. Although he did not testify, Rogers was found guilty by a jury after several hours of deliberation and convicted of first-degree murder and hindering apprehension. Prosecutors also allowed references to other similar cases to be discussed at trial, though he was not formally charged in every incident connected to the broader pattern. In January 2006, Rogers was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in New Jersey State Prison without the possibility of parole. Experts and commentators have noted that Rogers' crimes occurred during a period when violence against LGBTQ people was often underreported and underinvestigated, contributing to delays in identifying patterns and connections among victims. Investigators have characterized Rogers's method as opportunistic and targeted, drawing victims from social environments that were both vibrant and vulnerable, with the perpetrator leveraging anonymity and mobility to avoid detection for years. Richard Westell Rogers, Jr. is currently serving his life sentences at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where he remains incarcerated.